Hello, you beautiful souls, Grand Rising. Welcome to Wake Up. I'm your host, Sonia Poulton. I'm a journalist. I'm a broadcaster. I'm someone who hates all forms of injustice. It's Friday, the 17th of July, exactly 9 a.m. British summertime. Thank you for being here. I see that Pixie Willoughby has finally made it to the live chat, which is wonderful. Pixie is a regular contributor to our show. Hello, all. Thank you for being here. Very much appreciate it, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Rumble, whether you're watching us on Catch Up on Spotify. Today's show is, I hope, going to be very enlightening. So welcome to the show that knows there is no peace without justice. And so in our own wake up way today, I am dedicating today's show to a man who has still not had justice, rather, but I do pray that he's at peace. Today is the 23rd anniversary of the death of Dr. David Kelly. Dr. David Kelly was a leading weapons inspector for the British government who found himself caught up in a massive controversy in July 2003. 2 days later, after he had appeared at a government committee meeting where he was cross-examined, we were told that he was found dead close to his home in the Oxfordshire countryside. Now, before I proceed, everybody, please just reassure me that you can hear me loud and clear. I do hope you can. I do hope that we've not got any interference today. And it's been a really weird week for me. A very weird week. Good morning to you all. Lovely to see you in the chat. Thank you, Marilyn. Let's hope so. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. So today's show is not just to remember Dr. David Kelly, not just to pause and reflect on what it was all about, but also to state very clearly that it is my informed and evidenced position that Dr. David Kelly did not take his own life on the 17th of July 2003, but he was in fact murdered. I believe there are still people walking around, still prospering, still in positions of power who should be held accountable for Dr. Kelly's death. It is my understanding, based on both research and evidence, that the greatest injustice visited on Dr. David Kelly is people accepting the official word that he died at his own hands. What a grave injustice, and one I refuse to be complicit in. His death has never, ever sat well with me. Never again. It's just always felt odd about it, even before I had started to research it many years ago. I've interviewed people who also have had similar misgivings, including former Lib Dem MP Norman Baker, who took almost a year out to research his book, Dr. Kelly's The Strange Death of Dr. Kelly, which he's recently updated. Norman will feature throughout today's show. And there's also been other great works that I will draw on, including Miles Goslett's book, An Inconvenient Death, How the Establishment Covered Up the David Kelly Affair. We were told that Dr. David Kelly was driven by both depression and despair of the scandal he found himself in, and he calmly took a regular walk from his Oxfordshire village to a wooded area where he took his own life. This week, I decided to retrace that route to see how it left me thinking, to see how it left me feeling, as both an investigative journalist, but also as someone who has long reached the conclusion that he was taken out in a state here. And today's show, as I say, will look into the enduring mystery of what happened to Dr. David Kelly on that day 23 years ago today. So at the heart of what happened to Dr. David Kelly was Tony Blair's Labour government. And 23 years on, it's as if we've come full circle. Andy Burnham, who was in Tony Blair's government, is likely to become Prime Minister today, a Prime Minister who was not elected but selected. And Andy Burnham was in Tony Blair's government, and Andy Burnham's chief of staff has been announced as James Purnell. Well, how curious. It really does feel that we've gone back in time in many respects. These are absolutely the same people who were around the Blair government, and they appear to be returning to the fold. Although not Peter Mandelson, who was absolutely key to also some of these events and who was heavily involved with Tony Blair at the time. But it's very interesting about the announcement of James Purnell, likely to be Andy Burnham's chief of staff. And here's why. Miles Goslett first pointed out in his book about Dr. Kelly's murder. Did you know that at a 2006 Labour Party fundraising evening, a copy of the Hutton report. Now, the Hutton report was the inquiry into the death of David Kelly. So a copy of the Hutton report, autographed by Cherie Blair and Alastair Campbell, who was Blair's right-hand man, raised £400 for the constituency of Labour Cabinet Minister James Purnell, who then went on to be a BBC executive, and now he's being returned to Parliament. So they actually sold an inquiry report. Well, they didn't sell, they auctioned it. They auctioned an inquiry report into the death of Dr. David Kelly to raise money for James Purnell. Tell me it's not weird. Tell me it is not weird. It's weird. It's very weird. How quaint. A copy of a report into the death of David Kelly, arguably at the hands of the state, being auctioned to raise funds for the very Labour government that kicked him under the bus and then rode over him. I think not. I think not. Very weird. So let's go back. Let us go back. But yeah, we've essentially come full circle, which is why it's almost even more important that I'm doing this today in some key respects. So let's go back. David Kelly, let us be clear, was a highly educated, highly skilled, highly experienced scientist. He was born in South Wales. He had degrees from both Leeds and Birmingham universities. Some of the work that he'd done in the early days had been as a biological pesticide expert at the Oxford Institute of Microbiology. By 1984, he was Chief Science Officer at the Natural Environment Research Council. Then he was headhunted to work at Porton Down. Porton Down is Britain's chemical and biological defence establishment, highly secretive. Later, Dr. Kelly would recall that going to work at Porton Down was the best decision of his life. By 1989, he had become head of microbiology at Porton Down. His status as Britain's leading expert in biological weapons, recognised not only by the officials at Porton Down, but also by MI6, the Overseas Secret Services, obviously based in London. MI5 is for national, MI6 is for international. And MI6 and the people in government who used his services regarded him as one of the few scientists capable of debriefing defecting scientists, including from the Soviet Union. And it was David Kelly who was originally working with Vladimir Pashetnik. Now, that was a germ warfare expert who died in peculiar circumstances, not dissimilar to David Kelly, which I'll talk about later. And it was Pashetnik who first told Western authorities about the extent of hidden research into biological weapons that the Soviet Union was carrying out. But it was only like Dr. David Kelly who could really talk to him, who could really reach him. He understood Dr. David Kelly, and so did others. So Dr. David Kelly was highly valued. And when Russia agreed to the examination of its own bioweapons factories, Dr. David Kelly was seen as a clear shoo-in to lead the mission. And this was the first of really such missions that would bring a scientist, a very serious scientist, into close contact with a world unlike the one that he was very used to. He was now in touch with the secret services and how they were operating and their needs and demands, and governments and their needs and demands. And this was a highly regarded man who was considered pretty much, a member of the British establishment. He was not a man of politics. He liked evidence and fact. And in 2003, his desire for science and evidence and fact would clash with the desire of politicians in such a way that there would be no coming back for Dr. David Kelly. His time at Porton Down is of great interest, of course. It was there that he deepened his knowledge of germ warfare and more advanced defense techniques. He was well connected, massively respected as a leader in his field, and with a significant track record of uncovering illegal weapons programs. And he had top level access. You couldn't go any higher than him. He had access to the top secret documents, not only in the UK, but also in the US. And the thing about David Kelly, and it's important to note, no matter what you think about governments around the world, is that he was working for human safety in a political world that was determined to go to war. That's what he was doing. As one example, at Porton Down, he played a critical role in the mid-1980s in the decontamination of Grunier Island, which is a Scottish island which was left highly toxic for decades after World War II. And as a leading microbiologist, he used his knowledge, his expertise in biological agents to safely neutralize what was actually incredibly resilient anthrax spores that were embedded in the island's soil. So this was a man who wanted to do everything he could to manage the awful, horrendous stuff that happened in wartime. He was a goodie. And I'm absolutely convinced he was a goodie. And I think it was him being a goodie, a good soul, that led to his death, which is why it just feels so important to me. This has been actually, if I haven't already said it, I'll say it again. I will say it. And this has been a really weird week indeed. And I hope that I can capture some of that for you, because I think it's important too. So after all that, then came Iraq, and Iraq was really the turning point for him. So what we had, of course, was Tony Blair and George Bush pushing constantly and endlessly for war. And Blair at the time, I don't know if British people can remember this, but Blair was very much seen as George Bush's poodle, his lapdog, that he would do anything that George Bush wanted. But from the mid-1990s, Dr. David Kelly had been traveling back and forth to Iraq. And after the Gulf War, he was deemed absolutely the right person to contribute to the UN weapons inspection. And over the next 7 years, he would return to Iraq at least 36 times, hunting for evidence that he believed in part that there was the potential for weapons of mass destruction, but he didn't believe all the things that the Blair government put out, which we will tackle. And his views were very straightforward. He thought it was highly possible that Saddam Hussein may indeed have a weapons program. I mean, why not? Of course he would, but not to the extent that we were being told or sold, right? So, and what happened was, as George Bush and Tony Blair's war against Iraq was nearing its end in 2003, Kelly seemed to become more vocal with the journalists that he was talking to. He talked with journalists for a very long time, often telling them about his work and, on behalf of the Ministry of Defense and on behalf of the Foreign Office. And so he would often brief and debrief journalists. That was not unusual. But as the Iraq war neared its end in 2003, and of course we've had other returns since then, but on this particular occasion, as it neared the start of the Iraq war and as it neared its end, he was becoming increasingly more vocal. He was very concerned about this whole idea of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, he publicly contradicted Tony Blair and George Bush on at least one occasion. Well, I don't know if you know how much you do or don't know about these people, but often they're absolute psychopaths and they hate being contradicted, particularly by people that they think they own. Because George Bush and Blair had insisted that coalition forces had found and identified two alleged mobile germ warfare laboratories. But Kelly had a completely different opinion on this. And this is a man who had been there repeatedly, dozens of times. And he told the Observer newspaper that he had examined the alleged labs that they were talking about, and what Blair and Bush were saying was simply untrue. Well, you could imagine that that went down really like what, a cup of cold sick? It wouldn't have gone down well, would it? And, you know, he talked to journalists with ease. He briefed them on his work. And in the meantime, he was still continuing to hunt for these so-called weapons of mass destruction that Iraq apparently had. And that was despite he had already demolished these claims about these germ labs that Blair and his entourage were still briefing newspapers about. So it was interesting times. Then along came, well, Andrew Gilligan, a journalist for the BBC. So a year after publication of the 2002 dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, which stated that some of Iraq's chemical and biological weapons were deployable within 45 minutes, which was a lie, Kelly had an off-the-record conversation with Andrew Gilligan. Gilligan then put out a report on the BBC claiming he had information from, amongst others, a senior intelligence source who had told him that the dossier to make the case for war with Iraq was a lie, that it had been sexed up, as it became known. And that had been done in order to convince people to support what Blair and his master, George Bush, wanted us to do, which was to go into war with Iraq. And Gilligan's report triggered a huge dispute between the BBC and the all-powerful right-hand man of Tony Blair, Alastair Campbell. Now, Alastair Campbell, important not to underestimate the strength of his position in 2003. Blair's communication director, who was a former tabloid journalist and known as someone at times who could not be trusted. He was someone who was always seen as engaging in some kind of spin on a story and with a tabloid background. This inner team of Tony Blair was Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, Alastair Campbell, and Charles Faulkner. What a lovely bunch of people. And Gilligan said that the government probably knew that the 45 figure was wrong before even choosing to include it. And what had happened is Andrew Gilligan had met Dr. Kelly a few weeks before at a central London hotel to ask him about the case that the government had made for going to war against Iraq, a case that was coming under much intense scrutiny day by day on both sides of the Atlantic, in the US and the UK. And if anyone knew the truth of the story, then it would be Dr. Kelly. I do the same thing. As a journalist, you go to the best sources available to you. Andrew Gilligan was meeting with a contact for information. It's something I've done a multitude of times. There is nothing nefarious in their meeting. However, it was to seal Dr. David Kelly's fate. That first meeting led to all the steps that would lead to David Kelly being said to have taken his own life in an Oxfordshire wood. So at the heart of what they were discussing was what had become known as the Dodgy Dossier. And I think it's probably a good point to introduce some of what Norman Baker has had to say about the Dodgy Dossier. So just a bit of background, if you're not familiar with Norman Baker, I've already said, former Liberal Democrat MP. And at the time that he wrote and researched the book into Dr. David Kelly, he was still an MP. And he actually used his time as an MP very, very well. And just to be clear, I don't actually necessarily agree with the conclusion of Norman Baker or indeed Miles Goslet, but a lot of the work that they've done has been extraordinary and stunning stuff, really important stuff. So let me play for you what Norman Baker had to say about what became known as the Dodgy Dossier.
Were a grotesque attempt to persuade people that there was an immediate threat to this country from what was happening in Iraq, and it simply wasn't true. There were no weapons of mass destruction there. David Kelly, ironically, had been responsible for removing a lot of them some 10 years earlier.
Right.
And the fact of the matter was Hans Blix, who was the chief UN weapons inspector at the time, said that the British government in its dossiers was changing question marks into exclamation marks. The dossiers were there as a propaganda tool to persuade Parliament and the public at large that Iran was an immediate threat. 45 minutes from doom. Do you remember that headline in the Standard? 45 minutes from doom. What a lot of nonsense that was. And that was deliberately pushed from Downing Street onto the papers to make sure that the headlines and the coverage was the one that they wanted to see. Now, David Kelly, as a proper civil servant, as a neutral person, a professional person with some integrity, did not like the fact that the information which he and his colleagues were collecting was being misused in this way. So he's put in a difficult position, having to defend effectively a tissue of lies from the government.
Oops, I've disappeared somewhere. Back in. There we go. Sorry about that. So very clear what Norman Baker is saying. And Chris, yes, I've also seen George Galloway's film. I think it's called Killing Kelly, isn't it? Excellent stuff. Saw it years ago. So yeah, a lot of people and a lot of great researchers inform what I'm going to say today. So yes, I absolutely agree with Norman Baker. That is exactly what they were doing, was that they wanted to make the argument for a case to go to war in Iraq. And so they essentially created this hyperbolic dossier. And in his 2000 State of the Union address, before they went to war in Iraq, George Bush, the president then of the United States, discussed the use of weapons of mass destruction by the Iraqi regime. And later that year, he reaffirmed that the stated policy of the United States is regime change. They were very clear about what they wanted to do, and it had nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction. And so, as part of the UK government's argument for war on Saddam, that was when Tony Blair instructed the publication of this dossier on the 24th of September 2002. And the dossier, which we were told was based in large part on the work of the Joint Intelligence Committee, included the statement that the Iraqi government had continued to produce chemical and biological agents, included this mad idea that Norman referred to, that weapons of mass destruction could be deployed within 45 minutes of an order to use them. This was false. And it was essentially, it made the case for war. That was what it was about. And a whole part of the dossier influence was Blair's right-hand man, Alastair Campbell. Alastair Campbell, who had become all important to Tony Blair. And his background of newspapers and media being 24/7 news. And he essentially, as I said, brought this tabloid mentality to a document that made an argument for war. It was a terrible combination. And at the heart of it was this mad claim of 45 minutes. And it was splashed all over newspapers, as Norman Baker said. And Alastair Campbell, the newsman, had done his job. But at what cost? What cost? So Kelly denied telling Andrew Gilligan that the government had improperly sexed up the government's dossier. And Campbell was even more furious when Andrew Gilligan then wrote an article claiming that a senior intelligence source had told him that Campbell himself had insisted on including the contested claim that Iraq could deploy those weapons within 45 minutes. Campbell was on a very vengeful hunt to find out the source of where this had all come from. Denied it all, of course. And, you know, but the reality is that Campbell had extraordinary and unprecedented access. He had access to Secret Service documents. He was a press secretary. This was unheard of. And he was also involved in, you know, drafting and editing the dossier. What was the Prime Minister's private press secretary doing, rewriting intelligence reports of such significance? And just to be clear, I will never be okay with the public rehabilitation of Alastair Campbell. The way he weaponized mental health issues to generate sympathy is absolutely disgusting, particularly after what happened to Dr. Kelly. These days, properly rehabilitated, you'll see him on podcasts like Trigonometry, because they're all in it together, right? So, but very clearly, Dr. David Kelly was very disturbed about what the government was saying. He spoke with other journalists, not just Andrew Gilligan. He also spoke with Susan Watts, who did a report on BBC's Newsnight. There were a couple of other reports that followed, and they were still trying to find out who was this government source, because at this point they didn't know it was Dr. David Kelly. And so it began a witch hunt, because Alastair Campbell was furious. So was Blair. They all were. But Alastair Campbell was one of those people who couldn't hide it. And he was so keen also to be constantly like attention seeker. He was a press secretary. It was extraordinary. Yes, horrific is an understatement. Anyway, the witch hunt for poor Dr. David Kelly was on. And the net was closing in on him. And Kelly was aware that it was well known in government circles that the substance of the BBC reports, in particular the claim that had been made, was that the source was 100% sure that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction programs, but only 30% sure that he had actual weapons. And David Kelly said that sounded like his analysis. So what he did was, on the 30th of June, 2003, Dr. David Kelly made the decision to write to his line manager saying he believed he may have been the source of some of Gilligan's report. That's a very honourable thing to do. It's a very decent course of action, because he didn't yet know how they were going to harm him and kick him, to the curb. So he wrote to his line manager. He was working for both the Ministry of Defence and, as I say, the Foreign Office. And you know what is that it was considered at the time a very decent thing of him to do, to have been prepared to say, look, I may be that source. You know what? Very nice indeed, seeing as the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office then carried out a series of actions that would leave Dr. David Kelly increasingly vulnerable to very dark forces. And on the 8th of July, 2003, at a lobby meeting of journalists, the Ministry of Defence put out a statement saying that an individual working in the Ministry of Defence had come forward to volunteer that he had met Andrew Gilligan. And then the MOD offered a confidential swap of names with senior BBC executives, and because they were trying to kind of trap the corporation into giving up names of people involved, right? BBC refused to be drawn into it. And the row intensified between the BBC and the government. It gathered pace over the identity of the source, with both sides now sticking to their guns. And Kelly was torn between the two. And government sources at the Ministry of Defence orchestrated a series of leaks regarding Dr. Kelly's identity to ratchet up the pressure. And they said that the Ministry of Defence said that the unnamed individual was an expert in weapons of mass destruction who advised ministers and contributed to the government dossier on Saddam of September last year, which Dr. David Kelly had. But the key was in the last line of the statement that the Ministry of Defence put out. The Ministry of Defence, with the individual's agreement, intend to give his name to the chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee should they wish to interview him. Now, what was key about this was this meeting with the Security Committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee was in private. So even though they were offering to give up David Kelly's name, it wouldn't become known to the general public. But that angered the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which had just completed a similar inquiry into the sort of Alastair Campbell BBC affair of the Dodgy Dossier. And Donald Anderson, the chairman of the committee, immediately wrote to the Ministry of Defence demanding that Dr. Kelly appear before his committee. But that met in public. And this on the screen is an image from that committee. And Whitehall sources claim that the Ministry of Defence were initially reluctant for Dr. Kelly to attend the public hearings, but decided it would have looked like a cover-up if he did not. These people make me absolutely sick. They did everything they could to leak out who it was. I mean, when you're talking to journalists, right, and talk about somebody who's involved in the British establishment that works for the Ministry of Defence and is an expert in weapons of mass destruction, it's not going to take a lot to work out who that is. It's not going to be a lot of people, and they knew it. And what he was now dealing with was, as a private man who privately briefed journalists about government lies, he was about to be thrust into the spotlight. He was about to be hung out to dry as a key witness in a row where he was being used as a distraction, because the reality is it should never, ever have been about a whistleblower, right? The issue should have been, is it true or not? Did they lie in the dossier? Was it fake? Was it sexed up? The answer is yes. But the distraction was on. Blair and Campbell did not want people asking those questions. And so they focused all their attention on getting the whistleblower outed, and the media complied with them. Bad stuff. So the MOD continued to pour petrol on these kind of very speculative flames. And Dr. Davis Kelly's name began being bandied around in media circles. And the MOD went even further and suggested that if his identity was put out there by the media, the Ministry of Defence would confirm it. So that tells you, I mean, it's extraordinary stuff. Whitehall sources have since told me this is an extraordinary way for them to have behaved. It was in breach of all Whitehall rules for dealing with disciplinary procedures. Arguably, although actually he'd not done anything illegal, Dr. Kelly, by talking to journalists. In fact, that was very much part of his role. But they wanted to make him out to be the problem, when in fact the problem was the fake dossier. That was the problem. And the sources have since told me that the way that his name was put out into the public arena was designed to harm him. It was deliberately distasteful. And it was essentially to hang him out to dry. That was the thing. That's what they did. And one of the leading people who did that was this man, the very reprehensible Defense Secretary at the time, Jeff Hoon, a horrible creature. And David Kelly was caught between two powerful establishment institutions, the BBC and the British government. And he, all for what? For telling a journalist that Blair did not have the evidence to go to war in Iraq. To me, he's a good guy. He's a good guy, but he was punished and they went for him. And the BBC's role in this is absolutely disgraceful. They completely backtracked. Greg Dyke, who was the Director General, was sacked. And Alastair Campbell went absolutely insane at the BBC. And Richard Ryder, the chair, made an absolute vomit-inducing apology to the government. That absolutely proved that the BBC was not at all independent. It should have stuck by its reporting, because it was only sheer bullying that got them to back down, and the fact that ultimately government controls the BBC. And also whether the charter that the government holds for the BBC continues or not. So please never, ever be under any illusion that the BBC is independent. Not that most of my very savvy viewers would be. And then so it was all ratcheting up for Dr. David Kelly on the evening of 8th of July, 2003. Nick Rufford, a journalist with the Sunday Times, Rupert Murdoch owned, who had known Kelly for about 5 years, visited Dr. Kelly at his home in Oxfordshire. Rufford told him that his name would be published in the papers the following day. And he advised Dr. Kelly to leave his home that night to avoid the media, and said the newspaper would put Kelly and his wife up at a hotel. And soon after Rufford left, he contacted the Ministry of Defence and asked if Dr. Kelly could write a piece for the paper, putting forward his version of events. The Ministry of Defence press officer said that this would be unlikely due to all manner of security issues. And soon after that, the Ministry of Defence phoned Dr. Kelly and advised him to find somewhere else to stay for that night. Said, you're not going to be put up by them. And according to Janice Kelly, Dr. Kelly's wife, the couple left the house within 15 minutes, drove to Cornwall, breaking the journey overnight in Weston-super-Mare, and where they arrived at 9:45 p.m. that evening. Although, oddly, the trip to Cornwall was described by Mrs. Kelly at the Hutton inquiry into Dr. David Kelly's death in a completely different way to that. And both Norman Baker and Miles Gosler have issues with the version of events that we were told at this point. Gosler actually revealed that Dr. Kelly had played cribbage with a pub team in a village just down the road from his own village in Oxfordshire that night, and was there until 10:30 p.m. So how could they have been in Weston-super-Mare heading for Cornwall? And none of those on Dr. Kelly's cribbage team were asked to give evidence at the Hutton inquiry. I mean, so many people were not asked to give evidence at the Hutton inquiry. So we were then told that while in Cornwall on the morning of the 11th of July, Kelly had a call to tell him that he would have to appear in front of the Intelligence and Security and Foreign Affairs Select Committees. Kelly then returned from Cornwall on the 13th of July 2003, stayed in Oxford at his daughter Rachel's house, as his own house was now under siege by the British media. And then he attended the Foreign Affairs Select Committee meeting on the 15th of July 2003. And what was very interesting about this was that when he arrived, I watched the whole thing again yesterday to remind myself of it. When he arrived at the committee, he was accompanied by 2 Ministry of Defence police officers. And what was really interesting about it is oftentimes when civil servants were called before these kind of accountability committees, the MP responsible for their department would attend with them. That was not unknown. Jack Straw did it. Loads of other MPs did it. However, this man, Jeff Hoon, did not attend with Dr. David Kelly. Oh, no. Jeff Hoon made sure to get out of the picture sharpish. Dr. David Kelly was cut adrift by the Blair government by the time he arrived at that committee hearing. He was treated shockingly. He was fed to the wolves. And Jeff Hoon, who claimed to be in Malta that day for talks, was not standing by him, as anybody could tell. And they savaged him at the hearing in part. And they talked about how he had been served up, how it was highly unusual for his name to have been made public. Yeah, that was because Blair kicked him under the bus and made sure that Blair's own Ministry of Defence did so. They talked at the committee hearing about how he'd been exploited by the Ministry of Defence to rubbish Mr. Gilligan. Labour MP Andrew McKinley said, "You're chaff. You've been thrown up to divert our probing. Have you ever felt like the fall guy? I mean, you've been set up, haven't you?" And Dr. David Kelly was extremely softly spoken in this committee hearing. Fascinating man. They had to keep telling him to speak up. And they asked him repeatedly about his relationship with Andrew Gilligan. He denied being the single source of the story. And you know what? Watching it again, it was really interesting because I found his answers to be absolutely robust. He even showed a sense of humor. And when he was asked, "What lessons have you learned from this?" by the chair, he laughed. He said never to speak to a journalist again. Really, it was interesting stuff. And, you know, the thing is, some of it, what was going on was clearly a setup with at least one of the MPs appearing to work on behalf of Andrew Gilligan. It turned out that one of the MPs who was questioning Dr. David Kelly at that committee hearing was Liberal Democrat MP David Chidgey. And he was the first one to introduce the idea that Kelly had a conversation with Susan Watts from BBC's Newsnight. It was the first time her name had been connected with Kelly in public, and it was later established that Andrew Gilligan had not only sent Chidgey excerpts from a recorded conversation, but also gave Chidgey questions to ask Dr. David Kelly. The quote included Kelly's opinion on the 45-minute claim. "I don't know about you, but since when has it been okay for BBC journalists to furnish MPs with questions to ask a weapons expert?" What the heck? What the heck? Really weird stuff. And I want to just point something out here, because we are told this is 2 days before Dr. David Kelly took his own life. And what is curious about it is this is the image that everybody sees when it comes to Dr. David Kelly. But there are loads of other images from that committee, right? And let me just show you, and which actually shows a completely different, lighter side to Dr. David Kelly. But it's important to remember that the media has always been complicit in the idea that Dr. David Kelly was under such duress at this committee meeting that 2 days later he took his own life. But actually, Dr. David Kelly laughed off a lot of the stuff that they were saying. Here's a typical example of an image from that meeting. Now, doesn't that look slightly different to the one that has become most famous, which is the one that I showed before, right? I feel it does. I feel it does indeed. and another, actually, just to show you that it wasn't a one-off. Let me just show you there. So throughout, he, as I say, very robust in his responses. He didn't look perturbed to me at all. Right, the image that they've shown, the popular image, is a look of a man who looks worried and strained. But what the world has seldom seen, unless they've watched the committee or have access to other images from it, is Dr. David Kelly looking like this. And yeah, he had no problem with what was going on, but that was not what was being said about him. Anyway, the following day, Dr. Kelly was then up in that private session with the secret services, and the story began to crystallize between Gilligan and Kelly about what had really taken place. But the fact remains, the government and Blair and Alastair Campbell were gunning for Kelly. That is a reality. He had embarrassed them. He had breached all protocols to find a way to let the country know that we had been lied to, that a fake case had been created to justify going to war. I am in no doubt whatsoever that week would have been absolutely exhausting for him. He had been interrogated. It would have been exhausting and maybe at times very irritating, even a bit humiliating. But everything I've come to know about Dr. David Kelly was that he was a man who could handle pressure. He was, after all, let us not forget, spending much of his life examining potentially hostile territories for weapons. That's a hardy guy right there. So he had been interrogated for 3 days by Defense Intelligence officials and threatened with the Official Secrets Act. But it was his cross-examination in public, say his friends, that left him feeling physically sick, because then he was completely exposed. And it was very apparent that they were not going to stand by him. I want to be clear here at this point. Dr. David Kelly was a courageous, diligent man. And he had become the subject of a distasteful war because Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell were outraged that what had taken place had been exposed. So Kelly had been away from home for a few days, as we heard, Cornwall, cribbage, all that sort of stuff, due to the press camping outside his home. But he returned. His wife said he was upset and angry, but he was not depressed. And going back to that period of time and reflecting back on it, his name was all over mainstream media. He became a major name in media, which was really unusual for a civil servant. That's not often what happened. And leaks were being made left, right, and centre about him from both Blair's government and the MOD. And you know what? These people were really disgusting. And actually, we had an insight into what they really thought about David Kelly in the days following his death, when Tony Blair's official spokesman, Tom Kelly, portrayed in private conversations with media, but it leaked out, portrayed this idea that Dr. David Kelly was a Walter Mitty character. And essentially, they wanted to portray this idea that Dr. David Kelly, as a scientist, was a fantasist who had exaggerated his own importance. Tom Kelly was later forced to apologize when his comments were made public. But that tells you that even in the wake of his death, days after his death, they are rubbishing this man. And why were they rubbishing him? And this was Tony Blair's official spokesman, just days after David Kelly had apparently been found dead. This came from the top. That official spokesman was not going to say it unless it was what he was hearing in his office and from his boss, Tony Blair. And also what was very interesting was what also came out was from a British diplomat, David Broucher, and this is in after his death as well. He said that 6 months prior to David Kelly's death, David Kelly had said that if the invasion of Iraq went ahead, that he, David Kelly, would probably be found dead in the woods. Direct quote. Would probably be found dead in the woods. That was 6 months before he died. How could he possibly have known? And he reportedly made that remark out of deep distress. He had previously assured Iraqi officials that if they cooperated with United Nations weapons inspectors, they would avoid military action. And he feared the invasion would make him look like a liar and betray those contacts that he had built up over the years of going backwards and forwards to Iraq. So, yeah, the government were absolutely determined to destroy this man, even in death. Even in death. So there was always a smoking gun that became known as the Downing Street Memo. The Downing Street Memo is a note of the 23rd of July, 2002. It's about a secret meeting of senior British government defense and intelligence figures discussing the build-up to the Iraq war, which included direct reference to classified United States policy of the time. And the memo, which was written by Downing Street foreign policy aide Matthew Rycroft, recorded the head of the Secret Intelligence Services, MI6, as expressing a view following a visit that he had made to Washington. And I'm going to quote it directly. This is absolutely the memo that shows the lie that we should never, ever have invaded Iraq the way that we did. And the memo said, Bush wanted to remove Saddam Hussein through military action, justified by the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. But the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. It quoted Foreign Secretary Jack Straw as saying it was clear that Bush had made up his mind to take military action, but that the case was thin. The minutes were meant to be kept confidential and were heading, "This record is extremely sensitive. No further copies should be made. It should be shown only to those with a genuine need to know its contents." And as said, it dealt with the lead up to the Iraqi war of 2003. And it became absolutely clear that they were going to war regardless of whether they found weapons of mass destruction or not. And the most controversial paragraph of that smoking gun memo is when C is the code name for the head of the intelligence services, who was Sir Richard Dearlove at the time. And it said, C reported on his recent talks in Washington, there was a perceptible shift in attitude. Military action was now seen as inevitable. George Bush Jr. wanted to remove Saddam Hussein through military action, and they justified it as much as they could by Blair pulling together what became known as the Dodgy Dossier. That's how it all happened. Absolute fake, absolute liars. Copies of that minutes of that meeting, by the way, were sent to Jeff Hoon, the Secretary of State for Defence, to Jack Straw, who was the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, to the Attorney General for England and Wales, Lord Goldsmith, to the Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee, John Scarlett, to Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Michael Boyce, to Head of the Secret Intelligence Services, Richard Dearlove, to the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, to Downing Street strategists, including Sally Morgan and Alastair Campbell. They all had the minutes of that meeting saying that George Bush was going to war, no matter what. And the truth was that the case against Saddam Hussein was absolutely thin. We went to war because Bush and Blair and their handlers wanted us to. And the UK launched its major military invasion of Iraq on March the 19th as part of a US-led coalition. And the involvement took place in two primary phases, but the one that involved Dr. David Kelly was the one of 2003. You know, we have never recovered from what Blair and Bush did in Iraq. The estimates for total Iraqi deaths, directly and indirectly caused by the fake war, range from 150,000 to over 500,000. The vast difference in figures depend on the methodology used. But there are key breakdowns. You have direct violent deaths. These are groups like the Iraqi Body Count, who have documented over 200,000 civilian deaths from direct violence, 200,000 unnecessary deaths because Bush and Blair wanted to go to war. And they're handlers, of course. They're just names on the can. And then you have excess mortality, direct and indirect. There's been loads of academic studies about the unnecessary deaths in Iraq, including comprehensive studies that estimate a roughly 460,000 Iraqis died from war-related causes. And some surveys and retrospective studies, such as the Lancet surveys, have estimated that total death estimates exceed 600,000. So what Dr. David Kelly had attempted to do was absolutely the right thing, and they use it as an excuse against him. And one has to ask, had what he done been the reason for his death? And perhaps the fear that he was capable of more revelations that would follow. So that tells you where we were at in 2003 and what led to the events of his death. So I want to go back to Dr. David Kelly's last day, earlier on 17th of July, 2003. On that Thursday, the day of his death, he wrote emails to colleagues. He wrote to a journalist on the New York Times where he warned of many dark actors playing games, which was apparently a reference to his treatment by officials from the government and the Ministry of Defence and UK intelligence agencies. He would have felt very alone by now. Then a second email was also sent to another associate. Kelly said that he was determined to overcome the scandal surrounding him and was enthusiastic about the possibility of returning to Iraq. To that end, he had already booked a return flight to Baghdad. His aide, John Clark, had arranged the travel, and they had agreed the date for his flight to Iraq, which was scheduled to take place on July 25th. He had no fear of returning to Iraq. Why should he? He had just been shown to the world as someone who wanted to stop military action to Iraq. This was a man who was looking forward. Then around 3 p.m., he told his wife he was going out for a walk. David Kelly's last journey began from his old farmhouse in the village of Southmoor in Oxford, England. And Southmoor is a mix of old and new. You have centuries old cottages there, thatch cottages, beautiful. And then you have all these modern builds that are springing up. And when I had a very funny experience when I arrived in Southmoor this week, and I want to share that with you because, as many people know, I'm not just a journalist, but I'm also somebody who has a spiritual understanding, and I'm often guided by spirituality. So when I arrived in the village of Southmoor this week, I realized that I had mixed up information pertaining to the address. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to follow the course of his journey from his house to the place that we eventually were told that he had killed himself, Harrowdown Hill, which was several miles and several villages over. But so when I arrived in Southmoor, I realized I didn't have his address, and I mixed it up with another address of somebody that I was in contact with in Oxford, in actual Oxford city. So nothing to do with the village. So I was like, oh my God, I'm at a loss. Where am I? Where's his place? So I arrived in the village not knowing where his house was. And this was the first indicator that I was on the right path, right? So what I did was I stopped the car and I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my camera so it captures the village as I'm driving through it. So this is it. This is where I stop. Unbeknownst to me, and it was only later when I retraced my steps to do the journey, like from his house to Harrowdown Hill, I'd actually stopped directly outside his house. His house is on the left-hand side where you can see the wall. And I thought it spooked me. It actually spooked me when I realized it later on that day. And that I had literally stopped outside his house. So that was very spooky indeed. And that told me that I was on the right path. And when I was there on Tuesday, and also the other thing is that I chose to go on my own. Normally I would do these things with a cameraman or a camerawoman, whomever, but I decided to go on my own, except with my dog. My dog is a guard dog. And one of the reasons I wanted to go on my own was I wanted to trace the last journey and what he may have experienced. And I wanted to be absolutely in the moment. I'm that type of journalist. I like to be in the moment of what is taking place. I'm not really a journalist who necessarily enjoys kind of sitting behind a desk too often. I like to get out there. I like to get inside of a story. So yeah, this was kind of weird. It was kind of weird that this was the first point that I'd stopped outside his home without even realizing, because I didn't realize that his home was opposite that pub until later. Anyway, it's lovely Oxfordshire countryside. And you know what? I realized, and again, you can't be actually going there, right? And seeing it all firsthand, because the news has always repeatedly said that he died about a mile from his home. That's ridiculous. It's at least 2.5 miles. And very few people seem to see him on that journey. There were 2 people who appeared to see him that day. One was his neighbor, Ruth Absalom, who had known him for years and lived a couple of minutes walk from him. She met him after so in order to get from Southmore, his village, to Longworth, which is the village that he was heading for, you have to essentially go over a sort of, the crossover over an A road, the A420. And that brings you down into a point at the start of a place called Harris's Lane. And it was at the top of Harris's Lane where Ruth Absalom said that she had seen him. And this is the top of Harris's Lane, where Dr. David Kelly was said to have met one of his last witnesses, Ruth Absalom. So he walked all the way down Harris's Lane and got to the top of it, which would then lead him off more into Longworth and off to the hill. And that was where he met Ruth Absalom. And Ruth Absalom testified at the Hutton inquiry into Dr. Kelly's death. And she said that it was around 3 p.m.ish, probably slightly after. They're a bit uncertain whether he left the house at 2:45 or 3 o'clock. So it was all around 3 o'clock-ish. She was walking her dog Buster. She said that she talked to Dr. Kelly for about 5 minutes. She said he seemed his normal self. She was asked how he was dressed. She said, normally, I didn't take much notice. She was asked by Lord Hutton, do you remember whether he was wearing a jacket or not? She said, well, he obviously got a jacket on, but whether it was a suit or an odd jacket and odd trousers, I have no idea. Now, that was odd, because what we were originally told was that it made no sense to anybody that even though it was a rainy day, he'd just gone out in jeans and a shirt. So, and it's important to understand that the witnesses and the people first on the scene all have conflicting views about what took place and what they witnessed. Anyway, what she recalled to Lord Hutton was that Dr. Kelly said, hello, Ruth. And I said, oh, hello, David. How are things? He said, not too bad. We stood there for a few minutes. Then Buster, my dog, was pulling on the lead. He wanted to get going. I said, I will have to go, David. He said, see you again then, Ruth. And that was it. We parted. And Lord Hutton said, how did he seem to you? She said, just his normal self, no different to any other time when I have met him. And she was asked if that was the last time that she saw Dr. Kelly. And she said, yes. And she was asked if there was anything else surrounding the circumstances of Dr. Kelly's death that could help the inquiry. She said, none whatsoever. I'm sorry. I wish I could, but that is all I can tell you. I met him at the top of the road there and we had a few minutes chat. And then Buster was pulling the lead and David said, and I said to David, I must get going. And that was it. We parted and he said, cheerio, Ruth. I said, bye, David. That was it. So sounds like a fairly normal exchange took place round about here. And then we heard that he was also spotted by Paul Weaver, a local farmer who spotted David walking through farmland. Weaver recalled that they waved. Dr. David Kelly appeared happy, smiled, said hello. And this was widely regarded as the last confirmed sighting of Dr. Kelly before his death. And I suspect it was probably somewhere around here. Downhill now. It's beautiful, very isolated. I wanted to do this walk on my own, except I do have my doggy, and my doggy is a guard doggy, so she's not going to take any nonsense, and I do feel fine with her. But I wouldn't want to do this walk on my own. It's very isolated. There's like literally no one around. And I was spooked out, and it did feel, it didn't feel, it was extremely isolated. And what happens is you walk through Longworth, and then you sort of go down this kind of dirt track, and either side of fields, and then down on the right-hand side is Harrowdown Hill, which has become very well known, even though it's just really essentially a sort of copse of trees of oak and ash, which then leads up on kind of like onto a hill within the copse. And it's become very famous, been made into songs by including like Tom York, who has sung about Harrowdown Hill. And it is extremely isolated, Stephen. I was spooked. What I did first of all was I drove down the dirt track, and at the bottom of it is some farm buildings, but there was nobody there. Like, it's empty. Like, it's really weird. I mean, when they talk about an overpopulated world, right, you should go to farmland like that. So then after I'd driven down the track, I then went back, parked up the car some distance, and then walked down it with the dog on my own. And you are what appears to be a very great distance away from other human life. It's like it was me and the dog, and it did scare me. But this was a familiar rinse repeat poem by Simon Armitage too. Yes, Pandora, absolutely. He was walking down there, Nikki, because it was on the way to Harrowdown Hill, which was actually a very familiar route for him. He knew and loved this countryside. He'd lived in Oxford for like 30 years. And the official narrative is that sometime on that Thursday afternoon or late evening, according to police, Dr. Kelly took some tablets of coproximal, prescription painkiller, and cut his left wrist. Then he simply waited to die in the wood that he loved and knew so well. It's not impossible, of course, but that's only if you discount everything that followed after his death, which I'm not about to do. Back home, though, his wife, Janice, didn't know what was happening. She was worried that her husband had not yet returned. She called friends and family, who launched the first impromptu and unsuccessful search. At 11:45 approximately that night, Janice called in the police. Police came to Dr. Kelly's home in the early hours of July the 18th, 2003. 3 officers from the local station in Abingdon arrived, Abingdon is the area of Oxfordshire where his village is set. And they arrived within 15 minutes. They searched the house and garden straight away. Well, some people could say, he's missing. He's not missing in the house. Why are they searching? But police will say that's standard, right? But by 1 a.m., they had a search helicopter from RAF Benson, which was close by. It was fitted with thermal imaging equipment, and there was teams of search dog was also provided, and a 26-meter communication mast was erected at Kelly's home, which was said to be a mobile communication black spot, which I find very hard to believe for a government weapons inspector. And during that search, in the middle of the night, officers removed items from David Kelly's home. So they weren't looking for Dr. David Kelly. And the police stated that this was standard routine procedure for missing person investigations. But specific details regarding what they took and what were taken were not publicly itemized by Thames Valley Police, the force overseeing it. And they were not detailed in the Hutton report. And you know what? The removal of items such as computers and personal documents is standard for establishing a background. But by this point, he was still only missing. They should have been out there rather than in his home taking away equipment and information. And the police helicopter fitted with heat-seeking equipment flew over Harrowdown Hill, where Dr. David Kelly's body was apparently later found the following morning. They flew over there at approximately 2:50 a.m. in the early hours of the morning, and they didn't see him, and they had heat-seeking equipment. They did not see his body, but at first light, they started searching Dr. Kelly's favourite footpaths, and at 9:20 a.m., his body was said to have been found near the edge of the Harrowdown Hill copse. So I walked there, as I said. And this is essentially the area that, so as I say, Harrowdown Hill is in several parts. The dog and I actually went to the top of it. I got absolutely ripped apart. I had to throw away the bottoms that I had because they were so badly ripped, so much briar. I'm not even sure if people have been up the top of there for a very long time. But you first of all go in, and it's in that first area that it was said that they had found Dr. Kelly. And this was a favourite walk of his. And actually, I think you probably might be able to see from this clip where the hill starts, which we then went. I wanted to because it was, yes, John, a great location to bump someone off, completely isolated. I realised by going there this week how vulnerable he was. And what I will do, which I've not done for today's show, is I will put together a short video of the journey from his home to Harrowdown Hill. It's a beautiful place, Randy. Yes, a sort of place to make a horror film. Yeah, I was nervous and I don't get scared easily, because I was like, what am I doing here exactly? This feels kind of insane. Yeah, they murder with impunity and we do nothing, says Megatree. Yes, absolutely. And being there really crystallized it all for me. And important to understand, was that body moved and placed where we then see it? Remember, the images that we saw that was shown all across the news was of kind of police covering outside, actually at the front of all the copse and all the trees. So had he been murdered and then his body moved? And there are also many conflicting accounts from the first people to find him. They testified at the Hutton inquiry, and Lord Hutton said that their constant conflicts were natural. If there was anybody who was best placed to sort out this situation, it would appear that it was Lord Hutton, and we will get to him. So the following morning, July the 18th, the police used volunteer search teams, and it was one of these that found Kelly's body on Harrowdown Hill at about 9:20 a.m. So it was on the following morning on 18th of July, but he was said to have killed himself on the 17th of July, 23 years ago today, as said. And the two-person team who originally arrived, they differed in their description of the position of his body. One stated that Dr. Kelly was, direct quote, at the base of the tree with almost his head and his shoulders just slumped back against the tree. The other stated that Kelly was sitting with his back up against a tree. And the police and paramedics differed from both the searchers. DC Coe, one of the first policemen at the scene, stated the body was laying on its back. The body was laying on its back by a large tree, the head towards the trunk of the tree. The pathologist called to the scene, Nicholas Hunt, recorded that his head was quite close to the branches and so forth, but not actually over the tree. How could you have four different versions of how he was found, and the man running the inquiry saying that's perfectly natural? It's a scary country. Yes, it is. Louise Holmes was one of those first people to find Dr. Kelly's body. She was with her border collie dog Brock. She was part of the search. She said that there had been a lot of blood on Dr. Kelly's left arm, which was bent back in a funny position. But David Bartlett, one of the ambulance paramedics who pronounced Dr. Kelly dead, said he was surprised that there was not more blood if it was an arterial bleed. And PC Dean Franklin talked about how a wristwatch was lying on the ground away from Dr. David Kelly's body, along with a lock knife with a 3 to 4 inch blade with blood on it. There was also an open bottle of water. And they said that a search of the area revealed no sign of a struggle. And Norman Baker was the one who found out, not the Hutton inquiry, Norman Baker was the one that found out that that blade and the bottle of water didn't have any fingerprints on, had no Dr. David Kelly fingerprints on. Somebody had wiped those tools, I tell you that. Terrible, dreadful, awful stuff, Caroline. Poor wife. His watch had stopped at 3:33. This is Markerson. The woman that found him worked for the Ministry of Defence. See where this is all going, right? David's friend Tom Mangold spoke to his wife Janice Kelly on the Friday morning when David was still missing. She said her husband had been deeply unhappy and furious at the way that the events had unfolded. She said that he'd been under considerable stress, that he was very angry, but she didn't use the word depressed, and kind of nobody did, including his own doctor, as you'll find out. At 9:30 a.m. on that Friday, shortly after he'd been found, a Downing Street clerk took a call from number 10 that Kelly was missing. And then another call came through that a body had been found, and everyone assumed that it was Dr. Kelly. Tony Blair heard about David Kelly from Alastair Campbell. Blair was on his way to Tokyo from Washington, and on arrival in Tokyo, Blair, who was considered a very accomplished handler of the media. Both Campbell and Blair were very, very good at handling media. And Blair said to reporters, there is now, however, going to be a due process and a proper and independent inquiry. And I believe that should be allowed to establish the facts. And I hope we can set aside the speculation and the claims and the counterclaims and allow that due process to take its proper course. In the meantime, all of us, the politicians and the media alike, should show some respect and restraint. That's all I intend to say. Well, how very convenient indeed. And so immediately Blair put people on hold, didn't want people to be asking questions, right? And again, I have to say, I agree with what Norman Baker had said about this. Have a listen. This all happened, bear in mind, Dr. Kelly has been found on the 18th, and immediately on the 18th, the wheels clicked into place. This is what Norman Baker had to say.
But the interesting thing about this is that this is the Friday morning. On the Friday morning, Lord Hutton was found in his office in the House of Lords. Nobody in the House of Lords is in their office on the Friday morning, by the way, but he was found there on the Friday morning. Right. He was identified as a person to chair the inquiry by who knows who, Lord Falconer, perhaps Peter Mandelson, who'd been the Northern Ireland Secretary. Lord Hutton was from Northern Ireland, and by Blair. The terms of reference were agreed, and lo and behold, within about 2 hours, Lord Hutton had been appointed. The government acting with remarkable speed. But of course, what they did do is to divert media attention to the death of David Kelly onto the forthcoming inquiry and the question of the BBC versus the government. So there's a very neat political move to take attention away from David Kelly.
And I should just point out that the quote from Mark about his watch stopping at 3:33 was not actually, that wasn't the truth. That didn't happen. He was just being facetious, but I take his point. So yes, what they did was they immediately somehow had Lord Hutton in Parliament on that morning, and immediately an inquiry was launched because Blair wanted to make sure that there was no attention on him. And almost immediately the spin started. The government and media narrative kicked into place. Dr. David Kelly was depressed. He was not a public figure. He was forced into the limelight. He felt that he'd been discredited. He was worried what else might come out about him. Very little of it was born out of evidence. That is the reality. Dr. David Kelly's own doctor, Malcolm Warner, who had been his GP for 25 years, said that Dr. David Kelly had never, ever shown any signs of depression. But the government and media immediately went into spin mode. And also 4 years previously, Dr. David Kelly, on one of his visits to Iraq, had converted to the Baha'i faith, a religion. And that it doesn't condone suicide. If anything, suicide is not allowed. And so he had become a member of the Baha'i faith. And so that didn't make any sense either. And the only thing that the Hutton inquiry had was a professor who had a professor who was an expert in suicide, who said that, you know, that it was absolutely possible that Dr. David Kelly could have killed himself, but not his own GP, who had known him for 2 decades plus, right? not the fact that his own faith, and it was very spiritual faith, not the fact that his own faith disagreed with suicide. None of those things mattered. None of those things mattered at all. And some people wondered if this was a pattern repeating itself, because what we also learned was when David Kelly was at university, his mother died from what was considered to be an overdose of prescription drugs. The coroner's request had given an open verdict, and Kelly believed that she had killed herself. And as a result of the death, Kelly was said to have suffered insomnia and was prescribed sleeping pills. He was also at the time given an extra year to complete his degree, but he had never been noted as someone who had depression. Never. And Norman Baker, as I say, updated his book in, I think it was probably at the end of 2024, The Strange Death. And he has never accepted the line that Dr. David Kelly was depressed after that week. Here's what he had to say.
State of mind. He had a difficult public engagement with the Foreign Affairs Committee. But then the next day, he was attending the Intelligence and Security Committee behind closed doors. He was in much better frame of mind. He made it plain that the worst was over. That's what he was taking his emails to people, his friends. He booked a flight to Iraq to carry on his work on behalf of the United Nations. His wife was ill, and his daughter was about to get married. And he was a member of the Baha'i faith, which regards suicide as completely unacceptable. So for all those reasons, I simply don't accept his mindset was one that was ready to commit suicide.
And neither do I. Absolutely not. However, David Kelly was laid to rest at St. Mary's Church in Longworth, which this is what I filmed. And what was really, I found it so profound. I got quite upset actually on Tuesday when I was filming a lot of this. And so this was the graveyard that he was originally buried in for 14 years until he was exhumed, which I will get to. And this, what was sad about this in particular was, for me, I found, was that in order for me to get to Harrowdown Hill, when I was coming from Harris's Lane, to get to Harrowdown Hill, you kind of have to walk past this church. And so I felt that was really profound, that I walked past the church that he was buried in, that he would likely have seen on that day when he was on the way to Harrowdown Hill. And so he was buried in August 2003, a couple of weeks after he'd been found. His wife Janice and daughters Sian and twins Ellen and Rachel that were there, obviously led up to 160 mourners. And it's a beautiful little church, but I don't think I've ever seen a graveyard that's so empty, which tells you how few people actually live in Longworth. These are places that are barely habited. I mean, they're beautiful. They're like untouched, unspoiled English countryside, and they are truly beautiful. The service was overseen by the Reverend Roy Woodhams, who conducted the service, spoke of how proud Dr. Kelly had been of his Rhondda background, born in Wales, how he loved rugby and how his friends called him Di. And the vicar began the service by saying, "We are here because a tragedy has taken place. We are not here for the media or to make a political statement or to apportion blame." So clearly, he was very clear from the get-go that this was about honouring Dr. David Kelly. And he said, what is important about the funeral is that it really is a moment of great catharsis for the family. And it often is. Funerals are kind of seen as like some sort of, not necessarily closure. It's a really poor word I'm using, but I think you take my point. And the people in attendance there included Lord Hutton, who had already, been appointed to lead the inquiry. So he was in attendance at the funeral, as was Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott. Tony Blair was not. Tony Blair was on holiday. And the next part of what I'm going to say is one of those things where you simply cannot make it up. Blair and his family spent a 3-week holiday during the time of this funeral in Barbados, and they were there at Sir Cliff Richard's Caribbean home, Coral Sundown. And this is just stuff you can't make up, right? Cliff Richard lent Blair and his family the villa. He noted that Mr. Blair looked dwindled and haggard due to the intense pressure of the Iraq war, or perhaps being involved in something closer to home even, right? And Thames Valley Police, responsible for Dr. Kelly, their actions have been a cause of concern ever since his death, not least taking away information while he was still missing. And who knows the name of the investigation, Dr. David Kelly's investigation? It was Operation Mason. Operation Mason. Ridiculous. Norman Baker claimed that when he asked Thames Valley Police why they had called it Operation Mason, which of course anybody around here immediately goes, that's Operation Freemason, right? No, Alastair Campbell was not there, Mary. Shame on him. No, he was not there. So, so Operation Mason, the Thames Valley Police told Norman Baker that the only reason it had been called that had been, yes, you are on point there, Mark, that the only reason that it had been called Operation Mason, because that was the next name on the list for the operation. That's what they said. Yes, they went to his home. Yes, Caroline, that's what they did during that period of time. Although you have to dig to find that information, but I'm nothing if not a digger. Nothing if not a digger. So, and also Norman Baker found out some incredible stuff, including the fact that Operation Mason had started half hour before Dr. David Kelly even went for a walk. It started at 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. How was this possible? And again, Thames Valley Police told him that, well, it was timed like that because, you know, that's to cover the whole organization. Yes, Jan, good question. So who makes up the list of operation names? Good question. Good question indeed. So yes, so Operation Mason had begun half hour before Dr. David Kelly went missing. You cannot make this stuff up, right? You cannot make it up. And Thames Valley Police, they've since been kind of hit with a number of freedom of information requests. One of the best ones, in my opinion, has come from somebody called Mr. Hastings. And he wrote to them in 2017 and asked them incredible questions. They wouldn't answer one of them, including about DC Graham Coe being one of the first on the scene. And why didn't DC Graham Coe tell the Hutton inquiry that there was a third suited man with him and his partner, DC Colin Shields, when David Kelly's body was discovered? As some eyewitnesses had claimed, a third suited man, and we don't know the identity of that third suited man who was alongside two cops. Why? What was going on? And there was lots of stuff that was asked, which I'm going to refer to, the iffy stuff. But one of the other questions was, how did Dr. Kelly cut his left wrist if, as those who knew him said, his right arm was damaged to such a degree that he struggled cutting steak? Well, that was another thing that Norman Baker discovered, because the woman who knew about that had been out to dinner with him and seen that he couldn't cut steak with the hand that he was supposed to have cut his knife with. And by the way, I sourced the exact knife that David Kelly was said to have killed himself with. It's a pruning knife and it's not very sharp. Not very sharp at all. So loads of questions have been sent to Thames Valley Police, which they refused to answer, including, did Thames Valley Police remove wallpaper in Dr. David Kelly's home? And did they remove writing, because it was rumored that Dr. David Kelly was writing a book about Tony Blair? Did they remove writings to do with Tony Blair? Thames Valley Police refused to answer all these questions. All these questions. Thank you, Jan. They refused to. And also one of the questions to the police was, why was Dr. Kelly's death certificate completed on August the 18th, 2003, a whole 3 weeks into the Hutton inquiry? I mean, there's more, including why did Lord Hutton place an embargo, but I'm going to get to that. So the entire request was refused. Thames Valley Police are complicit in the cover-up as far as I'm concerned. There could be no other excuse for it. The freedom of information requests are still online. Among the documents that we later discovered that were taken from Dr. Kelly's home was a list of journalist names, a note titled Gabriel's Concerns, apparently about the weapons of mass destruction, and Ministry of Defence documents about Kelly's other media contacts. So an inquest, I referred to an inquest into his death was opened and adjourned on the 21st of July 2003 at Oxfordshire Coroner's Court, and Tony Blair and then Lord Chancellor, Lord Charlie Faulkner intervened. They did. Here's Charlie Faulkner. And what they did something completely unprecedented. So what they did was they controversially intervened in the inquest. They stopped it and they set up the non-statutory Hutton inquiry to investigate Dr. David Kelly's death. Now, the problem about that was this was significantly weaker than what an actual inquest could deliver, because the non-statutory inquiry meant that witnesses could not be compelled to give evidence under oath. And the coroner's usual scope for examining evidence was actually bypassed. You know, in cases of curious deaths, it is absolutely standard procedure for an unexplained death to have an inquest. However, Lord Charlie Faulkner, serving also as the government's Constitutional Affairs Secretary, invoked special powers to suspend the inquest before it could properly begin. So that was his role, the government's Constitutional Affairs Secretary. I may have got his position wrong before. And what they did was they bypassed entirely the coroner's court. They suspended the coroner. And the inquiry that they set up on that morning that they heard about David Kelly, very rushed, very hurried, did not have the teeth to get to the bottom of what could have potentially happened. And they sent Hutton to the funeral of Dr. David Kelly to make it look like he really was going to do the right thing. That's what they did. And Charles Faulkner, Blair's long-term friend, old flatmate, is now in the House of Lords. And guess what he spent the last year trying to do? Legalize assisted suicide. A leading player in the push to legalize assisted suicide. He's backed it, been very involved in it. And even though they ran out of time, they're going to restart it all again. Some dark characters only get darker with age, in my opinion. Yes, Ian, they're laughing at our gullibility, which is why I'm a no F's given person today. Outrageous stuff. So, as said, the Hutton inquiries was decided, and the speed in which it was happened told another message about what was going on, as Norman Baker said. And that's how it came about. The quickest organized inquiry in political history, I shouldn't doubt. And like Norman Baker, I absolutely agree that the Hutton inquiry was set up quickly and with a government's safe pair of hands. Lord Hutton was considered someone who tended to agree with government's position. And when Lord Hutton finalised and concluded the report, it was filed to the Right Honourable Lord Faulkner, the Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs, Charlie Faulkner. And the Hutton inquiry cost the British taxpayers in excess of £1 million. And Lord Hutton read out his statement summarising his report to the media in Court 76 at the Royal Courts of Justice in London. The parties to the inquiry were the government, the BBC, Dr. Kelly's family, the Speaker's Council, Andrew Gilligan, and Susan Watts from BBC's Newsnight. And after the report was published, the coroner then needed to decide whether there were grounds to reopen an inquest. And there should have been, of course, but you know as well as I do, it was never going to happen. And plenty of evidence, by the way, was held back from public disclosure. There are pages of evidence which is withheld on national security grounds, evidence redacted. They were not disclosing the content of personal witness statements, nothing like that. They also sealed documents. They sealed the toxicology report, although they were actually eventually refused. They were eventually pushed to release that, but not under the Blair government. That's a whole other story. And then after the Hutton inquiry, there was a parliamentary debate. Norman Baker again stood up And he talked about how the Hutton inquiry had been a whitewash, how it had been farcical, that Lord Hutton has spent more time on the BBC and government and very little on Dr. Kelly. And he referred to something that Lord Hutton had said about his own inquiry when he wrote in the Inner Temple yearbook. Inner Temple is the barrister's yearbook. And what he wrote, I'm going to directly quote him, and this tells you Lord Hutton's approach to the Hutton inquiry. He said, "At the outset of my inquiry, it appeared to me that a substantial number of the basic facts of the train of events which led to the tragic death of Dr. Kelly were already apparent from reports in the press and other parts of the media. Therefore, I thought that there would be little serious dispute as to the background facts. I thought that unnecessary time could be taken up by cross-examination on matters which were not directly relevant." So let's be clear about this. Lord Hutton had taken the basis of Dr. David Kelly's death from newspaper reports, not from his own inquiries. That's extraordinary stuff. Major witnesses were not called. Lord Hutton was absolutely on the side of the government, a safe pair of hands to come up with the right answers. The Hutton inquiry was all surface level. The forensic evidence that it produced was absolutely incompatible with a suicide. And Norman Baker actually believes that Dr. David Kelly was killed by people of kind of some involvement in the Iraqi regime. That's his conclusion. That's not my conclusion, by the way. But Norman Baker has, you know, everybody has their own opinions, and I'll get to what I think happened. But Norman Baker has been absolutely solid in challenging this. One of the very few MPs that was, he was still in Parliament at the time, as I said at the start, but one of the very few MPs who was really determined to get to the truth of the matter of what had happened. And as he pointed out, key witnesses were not called. The police officer in charge of the investigation, Chief Inspector Alan Young, who was since promoted at Thames Valley Police, he was not even mentioned, let alone called to give evidence. How can you not have the officer in charge of the investigation not called to give evidence? Then Mai Pedersen, who was David Kelly's contact in the US Armed Forces, probably knew David Kelly better than anyone else other than his close family. She was not asked to give evidence. And she offered to give evidence, but Thames Valley Police told Lord Hutton that she had nothing of value to say. Really? It was Mai Pedersen who had noted that Dr. David Kelly couldn't cut steak. I would think that she had plenty to say. And it's shocking, Lord Hutton's lack of curiosity, that there is this conflict in evidence that Lord Hutton apparently appeared to think was unimportant. And as Baker said, Hutton did not resolve the conflicts of the first people to find Dr. Kelly. But a coroner's court should. And so lots of people then called, obviously, for an inquest, because that's what should then happen, because the Hutton inquiry had not really got to the bottom of what had happened. And an inquest should be much more thorough, should be able to summon witnesses and actually hold people legally responsible and legally accountable. Yes, they all came together to cover it up. Pandora, I take that point, actually, what you just said. Norman Baker did some absolutely great work. And also he questioned about the death certificate as one example, about it being issued and what was the point of an inquiry to investigate the circumstances surrounding the death of David Kelly through an aborted inquest process. And that is what it was. And rushed out a certificate giving the reason for death before Lord Hutton even considered the matter. So you can tell it was all rushed. It was about securing an official narrative. And the certificate included the causes coproximal ingestion and coronary artery disease. And it subsequently turned out, said Baker, that Alex Allen, the toxicologist that the Attorney General had put in support of her decision not to reopen the inquest, actually gave evidence at the inquest that the level of coproximal was insufficient to cause death. So in that case, why was it on the death certificate? A rushed out death certificate that was in the middle of an inquiry. What on earth were they up to? We all know what they were up to. It stinks. And repeating it reminds me of how deeply it stinks. And also, why were coronary artery problems mentioned when David Kelly's GP said that he had no problems with coronary artery disease? And Baker and others said that the second reason for reopening this matter relates to new evidence. And it was subsequently discovered, as I said, by Baker through a Freedom of Information request to Thames Valley Police that there was no fingerprints on the knife, despite the fact that Dr. Kelly was not wearing gloves. And we're being invited to believe in a completely implausible scenario. Mia Pedersen said Dr. Kelly could not grip it, that she'd had a meal with him shortly before his death. He'd had an accident, a painful injury to his right elbow. And as his hands had gripped the silver, he struggled to get a knife through the steak. Then the helicopter times and routes given to the Hutton inquiry were all wrong. I mean, it just went on. It was endless. The MOD appeared to furnish completely inaccurate and wrong information to the Hutton inquiry. And the coroner's report, by the way, was lent on by Lord Charlie Faulkner. Ministers should never, ever be involved in leaning on coroners, right? So the whole thing, as we know, was set up to fail. And, you know, one of the things that Norman Baker has always asked, why did the police start the investigation before Dr. David Kelly had even left his house? All of that's weird. And as said, Norman Baker went on to say, I believe he was murdered by Iraqi elements. The police were too late to stop this, and a decision was taken for political reasons to alter the truth. And again, I don't believe that version, but I acknowledge what Gordon is saying. Despite all of this, many conflicts, and I've got more to tell you. Despite all of this, nothing has happened since. Nothing has been done further to enlighten us about what happened to poor Dr. David Kelly. But you know what? The aim of the Hutton inquiry had been achieved. Tony Blair, Prime Minister, was completely exonerated. As leader of the country, as the man involved in the Dodgy Dossier, which seemed to lead to the death of Dr. David Kelly, Tony Blair had the most to lose, but he was completely cleared by Lord Hutton. The report concluded that the principal allegations against the Prime Minister that he was involved in persuading intelligence officials to exaggerate the content of their Iraq weapons dossier, and that intelligence was inserted by the government knowing it to be wrong or questionable, was unfounded. What a load of rubbish. Disgusting and disgraceful. And Hutton did seal documents. Around 9,000 pages were originally published online, but Lord Hutton requested that some material be closed for 30 years, and also medical reports and photos be sealed for 70 years. That included post-mortem reports, medical records. And he originally, so Lord Hutton absolutely wanted that sealed. But when a new government came in, the coalition government under David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and it was Kenneth Clarke who was the health secretary. Well, he released the toxicology report and the post-mortem. And that was where we were able to find out more, that the evidence simply didn't stack up. There wasn't in his system all this coproximal medication. There wasn't. It didn't make sense. It is the satanic law of inversion, the establishment covering for the establishment. Reba, of course, why seal them if there was nothing to hide? And it did take another government to release them, because Blair's government was going to do it. And the only reason, obviously, that Conservative government did it was because they thought they would get some kudos from it. And bear in mind that Ken Clarke, at that moment in time, unknown to most people, was also purchasing contaminated blood from Skid Row in the US from heroin addicts and junkies, and was giving it to UK patients. So Kenneth Clarke was no savior or hero. He was up to loads of stuff. No worries. I'm happy to shine a light on this. But there was other weird stuff that has been highlighted by both Miles Gosler and Norman Baker, including Dr. David Kelly's dental records were reported missing on the day. there was a break-in at his dentist. On the day his body was discovered, July the 18th, 2003, his dentist reported that his patient file had disappeared from her filing cabinet. They went to the filing cabinet. They went to look at the file because they wanted to make sure that a reminder was not sent to the Kelly family for Dr. Kelly's checkup, and they discovered the file was missing. And then, as if by magic, a few days later, the records mysteriously reappeared in their proper place at the surgery. Thames Valley Police, who'd trust them with anything, examined the file, found no out-of-place fingertips initially. However, it was a 2011 Freedom of Information request that revealed 6 unidentified fingerprints were actually found on the file, a detail that was not reported to the Hutton inquiry. It's mad, isn't it? I'm getting to that, Nikki. So his records were removed. His dental records were removed, and then suddenly they magically were returned. Yes, there were, Hula, absolutely. Too many things went missing after his passing. Yes, absolutely. And that the fact that there were no fingerprints on the penknife. The penknife is a Sandvik gardening, folding, pruning knife. And as I said, I sourced it, and I'm really not sure how he was supposed to have done what he did with that. He was not wearing gloves. There was blood. He had to cut through nerves and tendons. And what was actually revealed by doctors was neither the cut nor the drugs were enough to kill him. He had less than 1 tablet of coproximal in his stomach, despite the fact that 29 tablets were said to be missing. So we were invited to believe that he took 29 tablets, even though we had also been told by Mia Pedersen that he had an aversion to tablets. And I understand that because I also have an aversion to tablets. The last time I was force-fed tablets was after I had a hip operation, and then I projectile vomited and fainted. I'm not good. When people who have an aversion to tablets are not good taking tablets, the last thing you would probably do is take them if you were intent on taking your life. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. So, anyway, after the Hutton inquiry, doctors came forward, deeply concerned at the Hutton report. And what you had was the Attorney General, the absolutely reprehensible Dominic Grieve, who did a review in March 2011. There was a campaign for a full inquest into the death. Clearly, the files contain fresh evidence about the absence of fingerprints on items found near his body. So that definitely didn't make sense. The witnesses' accounts, that's new, fresh evidence, not tackled at the Hutton inquiry. This should all lend itself to opening of an inquest. But of course, I don't need to tell you that Dominic Grieve ended up refusing it. And in fact, what he said, I think, was stunning and actually extremely revealing. And this is what he said: that he had not seen anything to support any allegation that Dr. David Kelly was murdered. Actually, I'm going to read a direct quote. Nothing that I have seen supports any allegation that Dr. Kelly was murdered or that his death was the subject of any kind of conspiracy or cover-up. In my view, no purpose would be served by my making an application to the High Court for an inquest. And indeed, I have no reasonable basis for doing so. This last line, I think, is key. There is no possibility that at an inquest, a verdict other than suicide would be returned. I'm going to repeat that. There is no possibility that at an inquest, a verdict other than suicide would be returned, because the state had already made sure that no other verdict would be returned. But this Attorney General said, we're not having another inquest because it's only ever going to record that this was a suicide. It's only ever going to record that it's a suicide. So anyway, the Oxfordshire coroner, Nicholas Gardner, controversially decided not to resume the inquest, and never happened. He said, my duty is to determine whether there are exceptional reasons that warrant an inquest. And if I thought there had been, I would have. The government was always very proper. I hope you were taken care of very nicely, Nicholas Gardner, coroner of Oxfordshire. But people still continue to push, obviously, for an inquest, as they should, even up to now. Really important, still not happening. There's like the Justice for David Kelly group. They've been very active around the area of Oxfordshire. They lobbied the government for quite a few years to try and make headway with a coroner's inquest. Wasn't happening, absolutely wasn't happening. so people are asking me, why was Dr. David Kelly exhumed? Well, therein lies the $1 million question, really. But first of all, let me just acknowledge this so that people are very clear that I believe that all of this is related. The death of Robin Cook. Robin Cook, we were told, died from a heart attack while out walking on a hill with his wife. And I believe almost certainly this was someone who stood up against the Blair government in Parliament, MP Robin Cook, and said about some of the lies and some of the mis and disinformation that was being put out by the government and their kind of media-friendly contacts. And he challenged it. And Robin Cook was eventually found dead in the Scottish Highlands. And I will one day look into it because I believe it's all connected. But I just wanted to note that so that people are absolutely aware that I do believe it's all connected. But of course, as you can see from the time, it's already like this is a huge, massive story. And I wanted to dedicate it really solely today to Dr. David Kelly. And so obviously, and also after that, by the way, again, that I'll talk about in relation to Robin Cook, they had the Chilcot inquiry, which concluded that judgments about the severity of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were presented with an unjustified level of certainty. Yes, it's called BS, it's called exaggeration, it's called hyperbole, in order to create an argument to justify going to war because Blair was Bush's poodle. So all of that I will cover in future. Dr. David Kelly had been absolutely right, and it's possible he paid for his life with it. And some people say, well, if this, I'm going to get to the exhumation in a minute, but I just want to say this. Some people say, if this is a conspiracy, then that surely also involves Janice Kelly and the Kelly family. And, you know, right from the outset, Janice Kelly was very clear that the events that had diminished him to a certain degree, but she had said that he wasn't depressed. Now, I want to be clear here that Hutton had ordered the post-mortem report to be closed. He said because he wanted to save the feelings of the family. I don't believe that at all. I believe it was because it would then reveal that what had been given the cause of death did not stack up by the time that we actually saw the toxicology and the post-mortem. I don't believe it was about protecting the family. And so it's really difficult because I am not going to implicate the Kelly family or Janice Kelly in a conspiracy. I'm simply not. Doesn't automatically follow that they have to be implicated. But there are many other things that could have gone on. Just imagine, and I'm just surmising, I don't know, but just imagine if they're aware that her husband, her children's father, had been taken out by these very dark players. She may well have gone along with the official narrative, not only to protect herself, but to protect her children. That is a plausible possibility. I feel terribly sorry for the Kelly family. I don't for 1 second implicate them in this, although I know that there are others who do. By December 2003, 5 months after Dr. Kelly's body had been found, Janice Kelly had put the house up for sale. And it was said that she was planning to remain in Southmore, the village that they'd lived in for 30 years. She was suffering from arthritis, which Norman Baker had referred to. And she had requested no media contact. She didn't support an inquest. She was said to have supported the Hutton inquiry. And it could well be that she went along with all of this to protect herself and her children. That could well have been. Why did the family allow his body to be exhumed? Let me get to that. It was actually said that it was their suggestion. So, as said, this was Dr. David Kelly's grave. Looks very solitary, doesn't it? That's where he was originally buried, in St. Mary's graveyard. And the official reason was that his grave was dug up due to fears of it being desecrated. This didn't really stand up to scrutiny. And the license for the exhumation was granted by the Chancellor of the Diocese of Oxford. And a spokesman said there is a presumption that Christian burial is permanent and that remains should not be portable. Therefore, a faculty for exhumation is only granted in exceptional circumstances. The body of Dr. David Kelly was exhumed at at the request of his family. That's what we were told. He had lain there in the churchyard for 14 years, but according to the Sunday Times, a source close to the Kelly family claimed that the Justice for Kelly campaign had placed placards and notes by the grave and held vigils there, upsetting Janice Kelly. And the campaigners wanted an inquest. They admitted to visiting the grave, and they insisted that they had absolutely not desecrated it. And I believe them. And actually, I think that it was what had happened with the campaigners around the grave that had actually originally informed Miles Goslett's book. And the campaigners, led by Gerard Jonas, said, we've been at this for 4 years. We did put placards, one placard, asking for a coroner's inquest. There has been no desecration. About 3 years ago, Mrs. Kelly sent the police around to me one Saturday night. They started questioning me. And Gerard Jonas told the Sunday Times, Dr. Kelly's body was removed in the last week of July 2017, headstone and all. They dug it up overnight. It was all done in haste. What looked like pieces of the coffin were left behind. Mr. Jonas had applied on at least 2 occasions to have Dr. Kelly's body exhumed. He or someone in his group, not he or someone in his group, he denied absolutely that they had desecrated the grave. And I believe them. I believe that this was used to make it look less suspicious. I'm not convinced that the Kelly family were behind this. I believe that things had got too hot because it's never gone away. What has happened to Dr. David Kelly? And don't forget the Justice for Kelly group. They were asking for an exhumation of Dr. Kelly's body. I think that they needed to get rid of it. And what we were then told was that he'd been cremated. Gone. And you have to, what the hell happened? What the hell happened always round? Well, I think irrespective of what anyone thinks about what happened to Dr. David Kelly, whether they believe nefarious, dark actors took him out or he took his own life, he should and he was entitled to a statutory coroner's inquiry, and they have never given him one. Never given one. Started it. Government told them get off the case, and it is never resumed. This is a story of very serious loose ends and very conflicting evidence. So what happened? Who killed him? Who benefited from his death? I myself am in no doubt whatsoever that Dr. David Kelly was murdered. The question is by whom? Some people have suggested, could it have been some insane loner who happened across Dr. David Kelly's path that Friday afternoon? I somehow don't think so. After my visit there to Harrowdown Hill, it's not an easy place to get to. You don't go there by chance. You don't go to Harrowdown Hill on your way to somewhere else. You have to head for it, right? You don't suddenly wander past it. It's not even properly listed on any of the online tools such as Google Map. You have to deliberately go to it, just like Dr. David Kelly chose to that day. One of the questions, I think, which is still outstanding was he alone on that day? And you know what? If, as some suggest, such as Norman Baker, that the Iraqis did it, that would make no sense whatsoever why the subsequent cover-up by the British establishment. The British government hated the Iraqis sufficiently to exaggerate a threat, sex up a dossier, and allow hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis to be killed. I think there are deeper questions to be asked. What did Dr. David Kelly know about bioweapons that the British establishment was scared that he might talk about? They already knew that he was unafraid to talk with journalists. Blair's government, before Starmer's government, was the most censorship and secretive government probably in history. They sought to control everything. It's no coincidence that Blair is still around pushing digital ID. We have not held these people to account. Tony Blair, Alastair Campbell, not held to account. Jeff Hoon, not held to account. Lord Charlie Faulkner, not held to account. And these people should. They have never testified sufficiently as to their role in what took place. But you know what? If Dr. David Kelly didn't take his own life, there are only a few alternatives. The first is that he is potentially still alive and that somebody else's body was discovered, autopsied and buried. The second is that he died of natural causes, but that's ridiculous. His doctor did not report that there was anything wrong with him. Some also believe that he was subject to an interrogation gone wrong and potentially his body was taken there. I think it's really plain old murder. I think it's absolutely possible that he was followed from his home. It was known, I think he was tracked. It was known that this was a regular area that he went to, and it was known how sodden deserted it was. Yes, Jeff Hoon was absolutely involved. He was the defense secretary who kicked poor Dr. Kelly under the bus. And yes, there was lots of other things. There were certainly dark forces. There were rumors that Dr. Kelly was writing a book. There was rumors that the police had taken away notes from that book. Certainly Norma Baker had talked to a small publisher in Oxford who'd had a meeting with Dr. Kelly, but it was early stages and the publisher hadn't even seen a summary of what had taken place. But that didn't mean that there wasn't notes back at Dr. Kelly's house. And there were certainly dark forces around. I actually yesterday spoke with Glenn Mulcair. You may remember the name Glenn Mulcair. He was at the center of the News International phone hacking scandal. He was the lead investigator. He worked under this extremely lucrative contract for Murdoch's News of the World. He intercepted the private voicemails of royal family, politicians, celebrities. Well, he told me on the record that he was asked by his newspaper to look into Dr. David Kelly. He even sent me the notes to confirm it, to look into it. And what Glenn didn't know at the time, and he's going to come on Wake Up and talk about it in more detail, what he didn't know at the time was that the information that he then acquired about Dr. David Kelly then passed back to the newspaper. And where did it go? He was tasked with the job. He was told by the newspaper, this doesn't look right. But he now believes that the information that he gathered on Dr. David Kelly was probably harvested and used against him. He said it was a murky world that he was in. And I say to him, what do you think might have been done with it? And, you know, in the last few years, he's completely turned turtle, right? He's been a witness for 14 years, helping claimants and victims who were treated very badly and who were spied on. You know, he said that has the phone forensics of Dr. Kelly really been examined? He sent me the list of phone forensics to do with Dr. David Kelly, a list of numbers. Hutton inquiry didn't go into that. So there was a lot of stuff that other investigators were looking into, a lot of stuff. So, you know, what Glenn finally concluded, that his role, even though he didn't necessarily realize it at the time, was to batten down the hatches, make sure that the whole thing was secure, that the whole idea that Dr. David Kelly had taken his own life was, you know, all kind of like, or batten down the hatches, make it secure. That was the whole idea. So even if we follow their narrative that he was depressed and that led him to taking his own life, why would he have been depressed, even though everybody around him said he wasn't? Why would he have been down? He would have been down because Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell fed him to the wolves without any decent protection. So even if you are of the mind that he did take his own life, which I am most certainly not, there are still people responsible for pushing him to the point of no return. And those people are still around making hay. As I said, Tony Blair, Alastair Campbell, Charles Faulkner, Peter Mandelson even. Peter Mandelson, who was in that tight-knit circle, has been disgraced by his deep association with paedophile trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Peter Mandelson is currently under police investigation. Nobody in that circle were good people. And the other thing that others noted around that time was there was an odd correlation of scientists who were dead around that time and who appeared to have been involved in who were microbiologists. There was a spate of them. Dr. Vladimir Pashanik, who was actually one of the first scientists that Dr. David Kelly had been able to gain his trust to do with Russia. He had apparently had a stroke in the UK in November 2001. Kelly knew him and had worked with him early on. Really weird death. unsolved. Then there was Dr. Benito Key, a cell biologist who died in Miami in November 2001, officially ruled as a result of an accidental fall. There was Dr. Don Wiley, a prominent biophysicist who went missing in Memphis in November 2001. Authorities later determined he fell into the Mississippi River. So some of these Dr. David Kelly had, had knowledge of, and they all died in very weird circumstances. And, states do assassinate people. That does happen. Or governments will carry out assassinations if it serves them to do so. And the US, the UK, whichever one it is. And these are realities. This happens. Talk to anybody, any Secret Service whistleblower. They will tell you if it is deemed important to do so, the state will take out somebody who's a problem. And also, there are questions about whether Dr. David Kelly was on some kind of hit list. The idea was that there was a normal practice at the hands of Iraqis to try and intimidate weapons inspectors, and that they would follow these weapons inspectors in order to, scare them. But he had great relationships with the Iraqis that he was dealing with. So I am fairly certain, absolutely, unquestionably, and I want to remember him like this, where he's smiling. But I am absolutely certain that Dr. David Kelly did not kill himself, because nothing adds up. Simply does not add up. And Cara contacted me earlier this week, and one of the questions she said was, David Kelly had already testified publicly and given interviews by then. What was the point of eliminating Kelly? Was it to warn off others, to send a message? Was David Kelly going to come out with more information? Was it to deliberately allow conspiracy theories to ferment? All of those things are possible. What I would say is that this is a man who had so much incredible information and had now been kicked under the curb by the government. He was capable of saying anything. He was capable of saying anything, and the government knew it. And don't forget, he had the highest level of clearance. So I believe that we know the truth. We know this man was murdered. And I believe that the truth lies at the heart of British politics. And of course, I cannot conclusively prove that. Not yet. None of us can. Neither can we conclusively prove that he was murdered. No, we can't. We weren't there. But there comes a point when the weight of evidence, resistance, and more becomes a cover-up. And that is what this is. That is what this is. Rest in peace, Dr. David Kelly. You did the right thing. Sometimes we have to be prepared to meet very substantial resistance when we set out to do the right thing. And that was what he did. He was prepared to do that. He knew the kind of people he was dealing with. Very loose ends indeed. We know it. We know it. Absolutely. So there we are. Those are all the things that I wanted to say about Dr. David Kelly today. I hope that I have sufficiently, if you are of the mind that Dr. David Kelly took his own life, I hope that I have sufficiently in some way or another kind of dented that idea that this is as said. You're very welcome, Colin. It isn't. And as I said at the start, I believe that the greatest disservice we can do to a man who tried to stop people being mass killed, the greatest disservice is to go along with the official narrative. You're very welcome, Mary. And I simply won't do this. I simply won't do this. Thank you, as ever, to everybody who supports my work. Thank you to you wonderful people on the chat. Thank you to Danielle. Thank you to Randy, says keep it going. Thank you to Kath Hutton. Thank you to Simon Milk. Not to be spent on Magnum ice cream. Why not? I love Magnum ice cream. And thank you, James McCartney. Today has been, in part, a tribute to a man who tried to make this world a better place, and very dark, nefarious forces wanted him out the way. That is absolutely my belief. And until I receive any other information to the contrary, I'm going to keep doing what everybody else of a decent mind is doing, and that is demanding a proper what's the point of demanding a proper inquest? They cremated him. So perhaps I've answered your question. Perhaps the reason they exhumed him and then cremated him was so that an inquest could never be carried out. I got there in the end, right? I got there in the end. Lots of love to you all. I will see you on Monday. Thank you for being here today. As said, I will, when I have a moment, make a separate video of the location so you can see it in more detail, and that will be uploaded. Thank you to everybody who's been here today. I very much appreciate you, whether you are here on YouTube, whether you are on Rumble. Thank you. Taffy Pat said heartbreaking hearing this, Sonia. Yes. And Joanne is going to check all this out. And thank you. And Shug said they are mafia by a different name. Yes, indeed they are. Thank you all. I very much appreciate you. Today's show is in memory of Dr. David Kelly. Thank you for being here. See you on Monday.